Okay, so I want to keep looking at possible questions that we might see on this particular exam, where we only have 2 free response questions. And this is a question that I grabbed from 2016, so it's pretty recent. It's an Alzheimer's disease study, and they give us the block heading, which most people read and draw all kinds of conclusions from, but it just simply says, study finds strong association between smoking and Alzheimer's. I had one of my students this year in my 5th period class send me an article about how there's a significantly lower percentage of smokers, I think it was in France where one of the studies was done, that has contracted the COVID-19 virus. So pretty relevant. And we had a little email discussion about the concept of lurking variables or confounding variables, because it's just an observational study. It was no experiment, but they just simply said, look, it seems like among the people reporting symptoms or reporting positive cases of the coronavirus, there's a much smaller proportion of people that smoke than what is in the actual population. So we had an interesting discussion about why that may be. Certainly no one is going to go and say, we all ought to take up smoking as a habit and as a hobby so that we'll be less likely to get COVID-19. That would be a terrible way to interpret those results, an uneducated way to view that. So this article says that they tracked the medical histories of 21,123 men and women for 23 years. For those folks that smoked at least 2 packs a day, so they're smoking 2 packs or more a day, the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease was 2.57 times the risk of those who did not. So people who generally smoked more, that's how I would take that, to at least 2 packs a day. That sounds like a lot of cigarettes. They're more than 2.5 times likely to develop Alzheimer's later on in life. Okay. So the first question says, what's the explanatory variable and the response variable? So I'll give you a minute to think about that and answer that on your own. What's the explanatory variable and what's the response variable? Okay, so the explanatory variable here, and of course there's a number of ways maybe you could articulate this and still get full credit. You can always look up the scoring guidelines to these, or if you want to see, how they would articulate it. But I would say for your explanatory variable, it's the volume or amount of cigarettes smoked on a daily basis, or amount of cigarettes smoked per day. Okay, it's the rate at which somebody's smoking. Right. The response variable is really is categorical. So the explanatory variable is somewhat quantitative. We could quantify less than 1. If I said how many packs of cigarettes you smoke a day, less than 1, right? 1 to 2, and then 2 or more, and so on. So it's almost categorical, but it's a little bit more quantitative. The response variable, however, is categorical, right? Either they have Alzheimer's or they did not have Alzheimer's, right? So the response variable is presence of Alzheimer's, right? Later on in life. Okay, and then part B. Again, I'd be stunned if this doesn't show up on the AP exam. Is the study an observational study or an experiment? And here's the key to your answer for this one. And a lot of us miss this because we understand the difference between an observational study and experiment. We think that's all we have to do, but they want you to explain why. Okay? So go ahead, take a minute and answer that one. Is it observational study or an experiment? And then we'll unpack the explanation part. Okay, so hopefully you identified this as an observational study. I don't know if I gave that away earlier in my narrative, but it's an observational study, and the reason is that the researchers did not impose a treatment on the subject. So what I mean by that is the explanatory variable is cigarettes smoked, right? This was not a treatment that was imposed. We just observed who smoked, how much they smoked, and then what happened with Alzheimer's. An experiment would involve selecting some portion of the group to smoke and another portion of the group to not smoke. And a good experiment would assign that at random. It's just not reasonable. It's not feasible to do something like that in this context, to assign some people to smoke and some people to not smoke. So it's an observational study. It doesn't mean it's not valuable, but it just means that we're not going to be able to say that the smoking causes Alzheimer's. If we want to establish causation, we would need an experiment. Okay? So that bleeds into part C. Right? What's happening in part C? Exercise status. They're actually making life easy for us. They're not even asking us to identify a lurking variable or confounding variable. So this word confounding, right? It means confusing. It doesn't mean that as researchers we are confused. It just means the result of another variable, in this case exercise, is confounded with the effects of the explanatory variable, which in this case is smoking. So let me show you what I mean. If we want to move from association, right, or correlation to causation, we have to be able to say something like smoking. I can't write smoking on there. Hold on. So I'm just going to identify them up here. Smoking is the X variable. Presence of Alzheimer's is the Y variable. What we would like to be able to do, if we want to go from association is fine. We say, well, they're associated, but then there can be a whole number of explanations for it. If we want to be able to say that smoking causes Alzheimer's, then we need to be able to control for other variables like exercise. Okay? And what happens when somebody exercises? Well, generally it's going to be good for them. It's a healthy activity. And more than likely, I'm not saying this is always the case. Anybody could sit here and say, well, I know people who smoke and exercise. Of course. Okay? We all know that. But we're saying we always have to speak in generalities and over the long haul. That's the whole purpose of inferential statistics. But for the most part, when people exercise and they're trying to take care of their body, they're probably doing other things like not smoking, right? If you're going to invest the time in exercising, smoking is going to make that even harder, right? And just in general, if you're trying to live a healthy lifestyle, you may want to eliminate things like smoking and drinking, and also foods that are not good for you. All of these things sort of come into play with why somebody would exercise. Okay? Now, what if exercise and some ancillary benefits that we're not aware of, like producing endorphins and things that happen in the brain when you exercise, what if in the long run that also reduces the risk of getting Alzheimer's, right? So as this confounding variable of exercise reduces the likelihood, it might reduce the likelihood that we smoke. I don't know why I lost that. So try this again. Here comes exercise. Exercise reduces the likelihood that I'll smoke in the long run. It doesn't guarantee you won't smoke if you exercise, okay? But then at the same time, as exercise reduces why people might smoke, okay, so that's a negative association. It has a positive association, or a negative association also with the Alzheimer's, right? It reduces the likelihood that somebody gets Alzheimer's. So here we go. Now we see that exercise, negative association to smoking, exercise, negative association to getting Alzheimer's, and then all of a sudden we look and think that smoking has a positive association to Alzheimer's, and it's just not the case at all. There's a third variable here that's affecting those two. So we could cross this line off. There could be no causal relationship there. It's just simply the fact that exercise affects smoking and exercise also affects Alzheimer's. That's what we mean by a confounding variable. The influence that variable has on the response variable is confused with the influence that the explanatory variable would have. So you would want to put that in words here. When it says explain, make sure you make it clear that exercise could have a negative impact on whether or not people smoke, and then it could also have a positive impact. I mean, by positive, I mean people not getting Alzheimer's. So we would say, I guess, negative in some regards. People who exercise are less likely to get Alzheimer's. People who exercise are less likely to smoke. And then it apparently looks like people who smoke are more likely to get Alzheimer's, and that's not the case.